All right, great. We'll use the Q&A then. Thank you all for your patience. I appreciate it. Jennifer and I practiced this, we and tested it, and it all worked. But I guess today it just wasn't really feeling it. So thank you all so much for your patience. My name is Liza Kostreva. I am the Director of Professional Learning for the Center for Literacy and Learning. I am based out of New Orleans. Just a little bit about myself. I worked at Phyllis Wheatley Community School for 10 years, which is a charter school here in New Orleans. I held several different roles there, started out teaching, spent most of my years kindergarten teaching. I love the littles, and in particular, those, early literacy skills. I was also the literacy coach there, and had the honor of being part of the literacy coach pilot with the LTOE. And then I did work as a literacy specialist along with being the director of professional learning here for the center. I'm very passionate about all things literacy, and in particular supporting schools and districts with improving literacy outcomes for their students. So I am just really excited to be here with you all today and to talk about 3Qing. So let's get started. If you have questions as we're going along, you can enter those into the Q&A. And we will have a couple of people that are monitoring the chat for us. My colleague, Jennifer Kelly, who's on here with us, and we'll be able to get answers to those questions for you all. It's a little bit different format. We're in a webinar mode, so you can see me and I can see your questions and answers, but I can't really see y'all. So just so you know, we'll get to those questions, and I'll pause every once in a while to just check the chat and make sure that we are monitoring everything that's going on there. At the Center for Literacy and Learning, our vision is that everyone is empowered through literacy, and our mission is to advance learning and literacy through evidence-based practices in the classroom, home, and community. Here are the objectives for our session today. We're going to define 3Qing and identify characteristics of 3Qing-based reading instruction. Then we're going to explain why the 3Qing system was banned in Louisiana. We're also going to identify common markers of a curriculum that relies on the 3Qing system. And we're going to understand how to implement science of reading aligned practices within curriculums that rely on 3Qing. So if you have instructional resources or curriculums that still really follow that 3Qing approach, towards the end of our session, we're going to dig into what can you do with the resources that you have to ensure that you're still providing really high quality literacy instruction to your students. And here's our agenda. We're going to start by reviewing Act 517, which is really going to ground us in the why of this session. Why are we talking about 3Qing right now, and how is it impacting what's going on in our state in Louisiana? Then we'll come to a common definition of what 3Qing is and really build our own knowledge of what this looks like and sounds like, both in curricular resources and in practice in a classroom. We're also going to dig into reading in the brain and really think and learn about how the brain learns to read, and thus what instructional choices and decisions we can make in order to build our students' proficiency with reading. And then finally, we'll close out with talking about 3Qing in our curricula and thinking about steps that you may need to take in your school or your district in order to eradicate these practices that we know are ineffective for students and implement more structured literacy aligned practices. All right, so 3Qing in Louisiana. Why are we spending our time talking about this here today? Why is this important, and what impact is the 3Qing model having on our state and the state of literacy for our students right now? In June of 2022, the Louisiana legislature, led by Representative Nelson, passed Act 517. And the text of this law says, the purpose of the act is to ensure that all textbooks and instructional materials used to teach students to read are high quality, fully aligned to state content standards, and based on literacy strategies that are scientifically researched with proven results in teaching phonological awareness, letter formation, phonics, decoding, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. This act has become known as the 3Qing ban. Additionally, Act 517 states that instructional materials and embedded assessments do not require or encourage the 3-cueing system model of reading instruction, visual memory as the primary basis for word recognition, and MSV cues in reading instruction. In a couple of slides, we're going to get into exactly what we mean when we say MSV clues and 3-cueing. But overall, this act is trying to ensure that we're not using curricular resources that rely on this 3-cueing system or teach word guessing strategies in our schools and to our students. If you want to know more about this act and really dig into the text of it and get into those nitty-gritty details, the amazing literacy division at the Department of Education here published this guide on Act 517. It's linked here in the presentation, but we can also send it out. It's on the literacy library, and it just provides a really comprehensive overview of Act 517 and next steps for school systems that might have questions about whether or not their curricular materials would fall under this act. I'm going to pause for a second to check the chat and just see if there's any questions that have come up.
There's a question
Great.
about whether they will receive the PowerPoints.
Yes, I believe a recording will be provided. So yes. All right, so now that we've talked about, why are we talking about 3-cueing right now in Louisiana and why is this important? We're going to ensure that we all have a common definition of what 3-cueing really is and what it looks like in classrooms. Simply put, the 3-cueing system teaches students to guess at words. So when students are first learning to decode and come to an unfamiliar word, instead of being taught to look at the sounds and sound out that word, students are taught to ask themselves these questions. Does it look right? Does it sound right? And does it make sense? So it's really requiring that students use visual clues or context clues to solve unknown words instead of relying on sound spelling patterns that they've mastered and know. Usually, this also requires students to just rely on context and pictures and syntactic features of a word. And there's also a real emphasis on whole word reading, or getting students to memorize whole words through the use of pictures or sight word drills that recall students to just look at a word, memorize it, and try to memorize that word as a picture instead of dissecting the graphemes and the sounds that correspond to those graphemes to help them sound out the word. So this is an example of what a 3-cueing instruction might look like in a classroom. If a student was reading the title of this text here and said the 3 little, and then could not read the last word, the teacher might prompt them by saying, look at the picture. What is the first sound? What makes sense? Which would prompt the student to most likely say the word pigs, because they can look at the cover title or the cover page and see, oh yes, that's a pig there, and that word starts with the sound p. So that's most likely the word pig. But once again, very much relying on visual cues, context clues to solve for those words, as opposed to phonics knowledge or the phonemic awareness skills that they've built. So 3-cueing also has teachers analyze student errors using what's known as the MSV approach. In MSV, the M stands for meaning, and this is where students use semantic clues to decode or solve for an unknown word. So for example, a student might read the word happy instead of glad. It's not necessarily changing the meaning of the text, right? But it still is not the exact word that was written on the page. And we always want students to be reading exactly what is written in the text and not substituting words, even if they're similar to the words on the page. The S stands for structure or syntax. And this is where students are using grammar or syntactic clues to read the word. So for example, the student may read jumps instead of jumped. So see how they're substituting that ending sound there for another word that is similar, but not, again, that exact word that we would want them to read on the page. And then finally, the V stands for visual. So this is where a student might be relying on using visual similarities of words to solve for an unknown word. So a student may read were instead of the word where. They look similar. There's really only one letter or grapheme that's different in there, but we know that those are completely different words that can very, very significantly change the meaning of a sentence or a passage in a text. And once again, you'll notice here, this error analysis is not digging down to see, oh, this student is struggling with these particular sound spelling patterns or phonetic patterns. It's once again relying on analyzing their errors through that approach of relying on visual clues and context clues to sound out words, or to solve for words, I should say. So why is this 3-cueing approach been banned? And what kind of relation does this have to how students actually learn how to read? So these are a few technical definitions that I'm going to read to you, and we'll talk about afterwards. The 3-cueing system encourages children to engage in a psycholinguistic guessing game, where readers use their graphic, semantic, and syntactic knowledge to read and understand a printed word. Research has proven that analyzing letter-sound relationships is how words are stored in memory. Yet the 3-cueing system ignores what is known to be true, underemphasizing letter-sound connections, solely resting on whole word reading, guessing strategies, and contextual features. This form of teaching does not support reading without the presence of pictures, graphophonemic connections, or explicit phonics instruction, leaving students with unreliable guessing strategies. I know that was a lot. I'm just going to pause for a second and kind of let everyone process and reflect on that research. We know from the body of research that we now call the science of reading, that's decades and decades old, that the 3-cueing system is an ineffective way to teach students to become proficient decoders. It requires them to really rely on pictures and context clues and to guess at words, which is ultimately going to make it so that they're changing the words that they're reading, which thus changes the meaning of a text. And also we know that as students go up and up in grades and advance further into their educational careers, their texts that they're reading are not going to have pictures. So we're not setting them up or giving them the tools that they're really going to need to be able to decode more advanced words if this is the way that we're teaching them how to read. I'm going to pause here again and just check out the chat and make sure I haven't missed anything. Great. Okay, it looks like we're all good so far. So we know that the 3-cueing system was banned in Louisiana. We know what 3-cueing is now. So how exactly do our brains learn how to read? And what do we know about this that can then inform our instructional practices so we're not relying on the 3-cueing system to teach our students to read? This is the 4-part processor model that's based on work by Seidenberg and McClelland from 1989. And this framework here really shows us what's going on in the brain when we're reading and when we become proficient readers. And all of this work is based on fMRI imaging that these researchers did. So they actually went and connected, fMRI machines to children and adults' brains all over the world and studied what was going on as people were learning how to read and as people were, taking those first attempts at decoding words. And this is what they found was happening in the brain. First, the orthographic processor is activated. And this is really that letter recognition space. So this is where we see a letter or we see a word and we're able to identify the letter or letters that are in that word in a written form. Once the orthographic processor is activated, our phonological processor is activated. And this is where that sound recognition occurs. So this is where a student sees the letter and then is able to map the sound or sounds that correspond to that grapheme. This is where the importance of phonemic awareness instruction really comes into play here. We need students to have very strong phonological and phonemic awareness skills in order to strengthen this part of the processor to have a really fluent ability to see a letter or letter pattern and say the sounds that correspond to it and use that knowledge to read a whole word. We know that getting down to that phoneme level is most important here. So ensuring that students are really proficient with blending phonemes and segmenting phonemes is going to strengthen those neural pathways in this part of the processor and make it so they're able to more fluently decode the words that they're reading on the page. This is also what we commonly refer to as phonics instruction, right? So when we're mapping a grapheme or a letter to a phoneme or a sound, that's what we're doing during that phonics instruction and strengthening the alphabetic principle for students. From there, the meaning processor is activated. And here, this is where all meanings of the word that a student might have are activated. So this is where that vocabulary knowledge becomes really important for students. And from there, the context processor is activated. And the context processor is responsible for taking all of the different meanings that are activated for a student and choosing the correct one based on the concept that's being read about, the information that's in front of them, the sentence context, the structure of the text. So it uses all of those different details to kind of distill down and say, okay, this is the meaning of the word that's being used here. So as you can see, this is a very complex process, and it happens in milliseconds in the brains of proficient readers. It happens so fast that we don't realize that this is happening. And that's ultimately the end goal for our students and for the children that we're teaching to read, right? We don't want them to forever be belabored decoders or to forever have to sound out every single word they see. Eventually, we want this process to occur so quickly and so automatically in the brain that they can see a word and say it and know it automatically. And that's how we build their sight recognition, like the bank of words that we would call their sight words. Not irregular or high frequency words, but the words that students can look at and see and read by sight because their brain is undergoing this process with automaticity and fluency. So we're going to do a little activity. And I know I can't see or hear any of you here, but I'm hoping that you all will be participating from this on your computers or your phones or however you're logging in today. I want you to just look at these sentences and try to read them. So I'm going to pause for about 15 seconds and just read these sentences and think about what's happening as you're reading these or trying to attempt to read these. What's your experience like as a reader? After you jot down a few of your thoughts there, you are most likely trying to read those sentences using context clues, right? And maybe you got to a couple of words that you weren't sure exactly what they were, but you could maybe kind of try and figure it out based on the other words you could read in the sentence. For example, here, let's look at this one. Give me a roll of, can kind of figure out that this is probably the word string. I know string comes in a roll for my, this is probably the word kite, right? I can identify the first sound, the last sound, that middle sounds a little funky to me, but using the rest of the context clues in the sentence, I'm gonna go ahead and guess that this says, give me a roll of string for my kite. Now let's try this. Here are two more sentences. Try and read both of these sentences now. And once again, I want you to think, what's your experience as a reader? Also, feel free, I know it's a Q&A, but feel free to put any reactions you have or any comments you have in that section of the chat as well. Jot down any reflections you have based on that activity, but most likely you are looking and using the picture clues here to read these sentences. I'm looking at this picture, it's a little girl, she has an umbrella, there's rain falling down on her. So I think this probably says the rain is falling down. And once again here, I can use this picture of the kite to help confirm that give me a roll of string for my, yep, I'm going to use that picture. This is the word kite. I want you to think about now, though, what happens when we remove these pictures? Or what kind of tools or strategies are we really giving students if this is what we're teaching them to do when they decode words? There are not always going to be picture clues for them, and there's not always going to be context they can use to solve for an unknown word. So ultimately, what we're doing is not providing them with effective tools or skills that they can use to sound out and solve for words that they don't know that they come to when they're reading. And we, as their teachers, need to be empowering them with independent strategies they can use to solve for words when there isn't a teacher or there isn't somebody else there to help fill in what that word is for them. So ultimately, these strategies that 3Qing relies on are ineffective for students to really build strategies and skills that are going to be necessary for them to decode words. So now let's look at this. What if I showed you this, these symbols right here, and I said these two symbols make the sound ah, and then I said sound out this word for me. I can't see you, but I hope a lot of you are trying to sound out this word with your mouths. You most likely would be able to say hot, hot. You're able to use a grapheme that you learned, the sound it makes to solve for this new word right here. This is what we want students to be able to do when they come to a word that they don't know. Use their knowledge of phonetic patterns to decode those words, because it's ultimately going to help them decode more unfamiliar words that they don't know. They're going to be able to apply their knowledge of these phoneme grapheme connections to more words than just words that we might want them to memorize. I'm going to pause here and look at the chat again, or the Q&A. Yes, thank you, Ms. Smith, for putting the word hot in. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So here are some here are some key takeaways. The 3Qing system forces students to rely on ineffective guessing strategies to solve unknown words. Children need to learn phoneme grapheme patterns through explicit systematic phonemic awareness and phonics instruction to become proficient readers. And equipping students with that phonics knowledge gives them an independent word solving strategy, which is only going to build their capacity as readers. So now we're going to do a little bit of history here. We want to dig into how this 3Qing system became so popular and where sort of the balanced literacy approach became so prevalent throughout our nation and throughout our state. Balanced literacy versus structured literacy is very commonly referred to as the reading wars, which I'm sure many of you on here are very familiar with. And in the 1960s, this is when the scientific research supporting decoding and language comprehension, supporting the fact that students need both word recognition and language comprehension skills in order to be proficient readers, started to come about. This is the battery of research that has been built upon and added to over the past 50, 60 years, and is what we now term the science of reading. However, in the 70s, this research was very much moved away from, and the whole language approach started to become very popular. There are some very interesting research articles about California in the 1980s. They basically overhauled their entire education system to solely be aligned to whole language principles. And there's some interesting studies that have come out about the impact that's had on students that were in that school system. And whole language and balanced literacy stuck around for a very long time. We saw it still being used very prevalently in the 90s, although it was termed balanced literacy in that time and moved from being referred to as whole language to balanced literacy. And now, once again, we're seeing this movement away from whole language and balanced literacy and back towards those science of reading and structured literacy principles that became popular in the 80s. I'm sorry, in the 60s. So we're going to actually watch a little video now, and I ask you all to bear with me just for a few seconds as I get the sound set up.
And this is a video on the reading wars. And as you're watching this video, I want you to think about two things. First, I want you to think, how do children best learn how to read? And then I also want you to think, what instruction do students need, particularly in K2, in order to become proficient readers? Jennifer, if you could let me know if the sound works. Great.
Where we focus our attention matters. Whether kids are focusing holistically, specifically at combinations of bits, at individual bits, those focuses of attention will dictate how kids learn skills, how they learn materials, and how they progress further in their learning. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's From Theory to Practice, where I take a look at the research so you don't have to. Now, the article I've selected this week is called Attentional Focus During Learning Impacts N170 ERP Responses by Yoncheva and colleagues. Now, for those of you who managed to stay awake during the reading of that title, I assure you this is a really interesting paper because it addresses one of the key issues in education today, namely the reading wars. So for those of you who have never heard about this before, in education, there's kind of an ongoing civil war concerning how do we best teach kids how to read. Now, one camp says it's all about teaching kids about letter-sound combinations. So how do letters sound? How do we link those together to make words cool? The other camp says we need to teach kids to read holistically. Don't worry about the letters, don't worry about the sounds. What does the word as a whole look like, and can use the context to recognize each word in turn? So you've kind of got the grapheme phoneme versus the whole word reading camps. Now, they've been battling for about 30 years, and this paper provides pretty strong evidence for one of those camps. But to understand what's going on, we have to take a quick look at the back of the brain. So the brain tends to recognize and process visual images holistically. So for instance, anytime you see a face, the entire face is processed simultaneously, or everyday objects are processed holistically. Now, when the brain does this holistic visual processing, it tends to do it on the right side of the back of the brain. So we call this right lateralization. Interestingly, amongst expert readers, words are never processed on this right side. They're always processed in the back on the left side of the brain. They're left lateralized. So what we think is happening in this part of the brain breaks down words into small chunks, assigns sounds to those chunks, and helps you rebuild back words up later for understanding. So an easy way to kind of conceptualize this is think of the difference between, say, a picture of a mountain and a graph. A mountain can be processed holistically. You don't need to look at every tree to know, yep, that's a mountain. But a graph is symbolic. You need to know what every word, every line, every number says if you want to make sense of the whole. So you have to first break the graph down before you can build it back up. That's what the brain does with words. It breaks them down, then rebuilds them. Interestingly, amongst illiterate adults or many kids suffering from dyslexia, when they try and read, we see right lateralized activation, which means their brain is trying to process words holistically. It's trying to view them as an image without recognizing that it has to suss meaning out of it. Now, cue this paper. What these researchers did is they wanted to see, can we guide people's attention in a certain way to get them to focus on different aspects of language? So holistically or small kind of bits. Can we guide that attention to change how people learn and understand to read different scripts? So what they did was they invented a whole new language script. So a bunch of squiggles and lines that when stacked together could form words. And they had different groups of students learn how to read this language. Now, the only difference is this. So each group, there were two groups of kids learning this language. Each went through the exact same process. The only difference is right at the beginning, group one was told to focus their attention on the word as a whole, use the image as a whole to try and make sense of it. Whereas group two was told to focus on the individual units within each image. So don't worry about the picture as a whole, break it down and see what's going on. So as you can kind of see, it's kind of the whole word reading versus the kind of letter sound connection reading. And what happens? Well, after training, each group was tested on what they learned during their training. And it turns out that when they were quizzed on words that they had seen during the training phase, the whole word reading group performed a little bit better than the group focused on the individual letters. So interesting. But here's the fun bit. When both groups were tested on new words, words they hadn't seen during their training phase, it turned out the whole word group suffered incredibly. In fact, they performed no better than chance. They were just essentially guessing. Whereas the individual unit group did significantly better. They were able to take words they'd never seen before and read them just fine. Now, here's the most interesting bit. Let's now draw it back to the brain. The group that was focused on the image as a whole showed right lateralization as they read the words, whereas the group that was focused on the individual units in their sounds showed left lateralization. So in a very real sense, in less than a couple days, these individuals were able to start to organize their brain to turn this activity into pure reading or simply image processing. So now let's bring this back to us. What does this mean for us as teachers? Well, hopefully you've caught on that idea number one is that where we focus our attention matters. Whether kids are focusing holistically, specifically at combinations of bits, at individual bits, those focuses of attention will dictate how kids learn skills, how they learn materials, and how they progress further in their learning. So we have to be very cognizant as teachers of where do I want your attention and how am I guiding it? What aspects am I getting you to attend to? Because that's going to drive learning. Now let's bring that back over into the reading wars. And we tend to see that this concept of decomposing words into letters and sounds is an incredibly powerful technique. If all skilled readers in the world are left lateralized, and I don't just mean in English, I mean any language across the board, this means it makes sense to give kids time to first learn their letters, then learn their signs. The more we can get this letters sounds combination together, the easier it's going to be for the brain to stop looking at words as images and start recognizing that no, they're just symbols and I have to decode them. Now, the last thing I think is really important here is this study just shows how adaptable the brain is. In just a little bit of training, the brain started to process totally random squiggles and lines as letters or as meaningful, complete objects. The brain was changing to allow for expertise to emerge and build. This means practice with anything, the brain can adapt to it and you could become great at it. Think about the people who can look at a fingerprint and see everything holistically in a heartbeat. They weren't born with that. They put in the time, the effort, the repetition, and the brain adapted to make that a skill for them. So this kind of shows that you can put in the hard yards and get through the struggle of learning. Anything can get stuck in the brain. That's the entire job of the brain, simply to adapt. So thank you all so much for hanging.
All right. I'll let you all take a moment or two to just kind of collect your thoughts, maybe write down any reflections you have.
And again, feel free to share anything in the Q&A section that you think would be helpful for others that are on the call as well. But overall, the key takeaways here for how children best learn how to read, we have to teach them the code, right? Just as he explained in the video, and I really think his explanation of that study is so excellent and so easy to understand. If we're not teaching them the sound spelling patterns, they have no skills to use when they come to a word they don't know. They're just guessing, they're relying on, memorizing a word as a picture, which has actually been shown to be the way that struggling readers rely on in order to read a word. In order to teach them the code, we have to have explicit systematic phonological awareness instruction, which includes phonemic awareness. We have to have explicit systematic phonics instruction, and we have to provide adequate practice. Shannon Bieber brought up earlier on our call that there are some students that may only need 2 to 5 at-bats with a new skill in order to master it. But there are other students that might need 100 to 200 at-bats with a new skill in order to master it. So student A might hear A says ah 5 times and know how to map that grapheme to the phoneme, and they're all set. And then you might have a student that needs to hear and learn A says ah 200 times. So we have to ensure that we're providing instruction that allows for all of our students, regardless of the amount of practice they need to master a new skill, provides them with those opportunities and those at-bats to master the phonetic patterns that we're teaching them. Whole language and balanced literacy overall are based on the idea and the philosophy that children will learn to read if you just naturally expose them to a lot of books. So if we put a lot of books in front of them, if we read to them significantly, then they're just going to learn how to read on their own. And I'm not saying that reading aloud to children is not important. It's incredibly important for both oral language development and also comprehension skills. But if we're going to teach students how to decode, we have to have that explicit phonemic awareness and phonics instruction embedded as well in our reading foundations block. We can't just give students books and expect them to learn how to read. Again, whole language really relies on those multi-cueing systems. and has students spend a significant amount of time independently reading in leveled readers before they actually know the code. And I think that's a key piece here too. It's not that we don't want children to independently read. It's that we want to make sure we're teaching them the code so that when they're reading independently, they can read those words on their own with accuracy and automaticity. So again, we're not saying never let students read independently, but particularly in those younger grades in that K2 space, they're going to need a lot more reading with a teacher, with a decodable text, so that they can get that explicit feedback from a teacher in the moment to make sure they're reading and sounding out words correctly. And then also that they're getting a significant number of at-bats with reading words with learned sound spelling patterns. Another marker of whole language, there might be some phonics instruction embedded in it. However, it's not explicit and it's not systematic. And oftentimes the lessons, these sort of phonics mini lessons, will be embedded in other parts of the day. So it's not actually the main focus or the meat of a lesson. And at the forefront of this discussion now is the need for science of reading aligned instructional practices in the classroom and practices that follow the structured literacy approach. So we've defined balanced literacy, we've talked about whole language. Now, what is structured literacy? Structured literacy is both the what and the how we teach students how to read. I really love that this image from the International Dyslexia Association, because I think it really just encapsulates what structured literacy is. First, we have the inner circle, and the inner circle is the what we teach. We need to teach phonology. We have to start first by teaching students those speech sounds, how to identify the sounds, how to articulate the sounds and manipulate them. We also need to teach those sound spelling combinations. So letter sound associations starting from the smallest units to the larger units. So first teaching those individual consonants and vowels before moving on and teaching more complex grapheme patterns. We also have to teach more advanced skills, including syllables, morphology, syntax, and semantics. But all of these need to be incorporated in our foundational reading blocks. And then the outer circle is the how we teach these things. So how do we go about teaching phonology and those sound symbol relationships? First, the instruction needs to be explicit. There has to be strong modeling, and our instruction should really follow that I do, we do, you do gradual release of responsibility. Teachers need to be providing really explicit and targeted feedback during these sessions too with students to ensure that students aren't practicing anything wrong, right? We don't want them to keep saying the short I sound incorrectly. We want to catch that as fast as we can and correct it so that we're helping them wire their brain correctly to see that letter and know what those sounds are. Instruction also needs to be systematic. That means you're moving from the simplest to the most complex. So we don't want to throw students into reading words with word families or trying to read word chunks if we haven't taught them the individual short vowel sounds yet or the individual consonants, right? We want to move from the simplest to the most complex. Instruction should also be cumulative. Are we reviewing concepts we've already taught? Are we going back and spiraling in skills that students have learned in previous lessons to ensure that those students who might need more at-bats and more practice have that opportunity in our classrooms? We also want the instruction to be diagnostic. Are we really targeted with collecting data and then acting on that data, right? We want to ensure that our instruction is really targeted and prescriptive to the needs of the students in our classroom. And we're using the data that we're collecting in our classrooms to provide that differentiated and individualized instruction to students, whether that's in their tier 1 in time or in small group time. And finally, even though it's not pictured here in this visual, a really big component of structured literacy is ensuring that it is multisensory. We want to incorporate as many modalities of instruction as we can. So auditory, visual, kinesthetic, because what you're ultimately doing is activating more neural pathways and more wires in the brain, which is ultimately just going to strengthen that 4-part processor that we discussed earlier. So the more neural pathways that we can get activated, the more the more neurons are firing, the more wires we're strengthening, the more accurate and automatic these skills are going to become for students. So what do these two approaches to reading instruction sort of look like compared to one another? Let's start with balanced literacy. And these are some elements that are very common in a balanced literacy classroom. First, no phonemic awareness instruction, or a very haphazard and random approach. So once again, maybe it's there, but it's not systematic in the way the scope and sequence is set out to teach students. You'll often have a lack of code-based instruction. So again, very minimal or no phonics instruction. The focus on guessing using context clues, pictures, or visuals to read words. The presence of leveled readers. A lot of drills using flashcards, having students memorize high frequency words. And then significant time devoted to independent reading or that workshop model. You'll also see a lot of times a teacher or an instructor ignoring a word that's read incorrectly if it doesn't interfere with the comprehension of the text. So going back earlier in the session, not correcting the student that reads happy instead of glad, even though we know that's ultimately going to hurt them in the long run. So what are some common elements now of a structured literacy classroom? We have that explicit, systematic, sequential phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. There's a clear focus on sounding out words using code-based knowledge. So we're always bringing our students back to relying on their knowledge of sounds and sound spelling patterns to decode unknown words. There's a presence of decodable readers so that after students learn a new grapheme phoneme connection, they have time to practice that, first in the context of isolated words and then in the context of a connected text. There's high frequency words are taught through phonetic patterns, which we'll get into a little bit more on another slide in a few minutes. And there's a lot more direct instruction than independent reading in those early grades when students are still learning so heavily how to decode and how to read. And again, there's that corrective feedback provided. So every misword read, no matter whether it interferes with comprehension or not, is corrected and is addressed. And those error corrections really focus on getting students to focus on the sounds. So when students read a word incorrectly, the teacher is always bringing them back to what is that sound? Or what sound does this letter make or say? Instead of having them use any other type of guessing or context strategy to figure out those words. Before we jump into 3Qing and curricula, I'm just going to check the chat briefly to see. Thank you, Ms. Thank you, Ms. I can't see the first name, Bergeron, for that. Yes, we're trying and hoping that all teachers can have this information. That is ultimately our goal for sure. So now that we've talked about the 3Qing ban in Louisiana, why that ban happened, and what kind of instruction we know students really need in order to become proficient readers and graduate from their second grade classrooms being able to read text and ready to read to learn instead of learn to read, we're going to look at curriculum specifically now and think about both environmental factors and also instructional resources we might see in our classrooms, in our schools, in our districts that are hints or markers to us that we're more aligned to a balanced literacy approach or a structured literacy approach. These are some very common elements of a more balanced literacy aligned classroom. You will see a lot of leveled readers. You'll see kind of these reading level charts where students might be, a letter C. And so they go to the C bucket and pick out the book that's in the C bucket. And, those are the books that they can choose from in the library. There is generally reading instruction, or the foundations block follows a workshop model where a teacher will give a quick mini lesson on a skill, and then we'll release the students to read independently and then pull students either as a small group or go and have individual conferences with students to help them with these skills. But the majority of that block and that time is really spent with students just reading independently and kind of waiting for the teacher to come to them to help them with this skill that was the focus of the mini lesson. There's also a strong presence generally with guided reading. And guided reading that focuses on teaching those 3Qing strategies and these questions like, look at the picture, what makes sense, look at the first sound. And we might even see these posters that I will admit I had in my classroom when I first started teaching. But when we know better, we do better. And we're all on this learning journey together. But this is where you might see eagle eye or chunky monkey or stretchy snake and these sort of cutesy posters that we think are going to help students, but that are really just not going to equip them with the ability to decode words in the long run. So let's look at the other side now. What do we want to be seeing in our classrooms? First, we really want there to be a sound awareness first approach. We want to be, again, focusing on sounds, ensuring we're teaching students how to say and articulate sounds. Are we teaching them what our mouths are doing or what our mouth looks like? Are we having them look at mirrors when they're first learning a sound, or look at their partner's mouths and see what it looks like when they're making a new sound? Is there really strong and explicit both phonological and phonemic awareness instruction happening? We hope to see a sound wall as well. So this is where we're moving from just organizing words we're learning or sounds we're learning by the first letter to really thinking about the sounds and what phonemes are these graphemes representing. So for example, a traditional word wall, you'd have the word to and the word there, right? Both under the letter T. But in the word to, the letter T is making the sound T, and in the word there, the letter T is actually working with that letter H, right? That digraph sound to make the sound Z. We don't want students to think that those are, should both be categorized under the letter T. Instead of just thinking about letters, we want them to really be thinking about sounds. So in a sound wall, the word to would be under the T sound, and the word there would be under the picture of the digraph TH that's representing the Z sound. We also want to see a presence of these sound posters. So is there sort of, a history or a wall dedicated to all of the sounds that students have learned? Are there visuals paired with these sounds, or an anchor word that students can use to remember what these letter sounds stand for, that they can then use and refer to when they're trying to read unknown words on their own? And I promised we'd come back and talk about those irregular words and sight words, but we really want to teach those through the process of phonetic decoding as well. So instead of just showing students the word does and saying, this is does, what word? Does, memorize it, great, let's move on. We want to dissect the word and decode it by its sounds and point out the sounds that are irregular to them so that they're still approaching it from that decoding perspective. So for example, with this word does, if we were to go through that process, we would say, okay, this is the word does. Let's sound it out together. Does. The letter D is making the sound we'd expect it to make, right? It's making that sound D. But when I get to these two letters OE, they're making a tricky sound. They're making the sound Say that sound with me. Good. That's not what we would normally expect those two letters to say together, or the letter O and E to say. And then finally, the letter S is making the sound Z. And then depending on where you were in your phonics scope and sequence, your students might have already learned that S can say Z at the end of a word. If they haven't, you would want to explain that to them and then go back and practice decoding that word. This is a much more effective way at helping students to continue to really dissect every single part and every single letter sound in a word as they're reading, which we know aligns to the research and aligns to the evidence-based best practices. Again, we want to see that multisensory approach, right? We want to see those Alconin boxes and students using chips and cubes or whatever manipulative you might have in those phonemic awareness exercises and in your phonics instruction. So you might start out having students say a word and then segment that word into sounds and move a chip into a box for each of those sounds they hear in the word. And then you might move on to even adding the grapheme, where they then remove the chip and write the letter that represents that sound that they said in the word. Again, though, that multisensory approach, incorporating manipulatives, incorporating movement into these activities is only going to help strengthen those connections for students. And finally, again, we really want to see those decodable readers. So after students learn the short A sound, they've been taught the sound, they've then been taught that the letter A can make this sound, they have read words with the short A sound, they've encoded or dictated words with that sound, Then we want to move them into reading words with those sounds within the context of connected text. And not only is this giving them those extra at-bats that they need, that extra practice to build their skills, it's also helping them see the connection between learning a letter sound and learning to read, which is ultimately what we want, right? We want them to see the value and the importance of learning sounds. I learned this sound today, now I can read words with it, now I can read a text with it. And instead of focusing on the decoding and using all of my cognitive energy to decode these words, I'm eventually going to know the sound and these sounds so well that I can, again, just put all of my attention and cognitive desk space towards the meaning. And that's where we want students to be. And that's where we want to go and head with this phonics instruction. I want you to take a moment and you can continue this reflection after this session. But after, learning about balanced literacy and talking about structured literacy today, thinking about, are there any elements of balanced literacy or a 3Qing approach to instruction present right now in your literacy curriculums and instructional practices? I know it says K2, but that's just because this is typically where this reading foundations instruction is really happening, but I want you to think broadly too. So if you are, in a middle school or a high school, I want you to think about that as well. And if the answer to that question is yes, what can you do to incorporate more structured literacy practices? And again, feel free to just type your thoughts into that Q&A portion or type any sort of reflections that you're coming to there, or anything that you think might be helpful to anyone else that's on the webinar. And as you're reflecting and as you take time after we leave our session today, I want you to think first, what does your schedule look like for students? So when you're also thinking about if you're incorporating structured literacy practices, we have to ensure that we have the time built into our schedules for a really high quality and effective reading foundations block. This is the sample schedule that we developed. And as you can see, it includes phonological awareness, an introduction to a new sound pattern, and again, that practice with word reading, dictation, and decodable text to really just hit that sound pattern hard with practice. The LDOE also has a really excellent resource in their literacy library that can help you either as a school or a system at a system level, figure out what a reading foundation schedule should look like in your buildings. At a minimum in K2, students should have 60 minutes of reading foundations every single day. And beyond that, it still is recommended students have 30 to 45 minutes of foundational reading skills time within their day. So, as you think about that, use these resources that we have for you, either this resource here or the resources on the literacy library to help you plan out and ensure that you're really developing a structure to allow for these foundational reading blocks to happen effectively. If we don't give it the time and if we don't give it the space, then it's never going to happen. It has to be a priority, and it has to be clear to teachers that it's a priority. And again, this will all be shared out after this is over, but this just goes into a little bit more detail of what each of these components could look like or sound like. You'll notice that it's very explicit with that I do, we do, you do gradual release. So really having that strong teacher model when you're introducing a new objective or a new skill before releasing students to practice that independently. And finally, before we close out and finish today, I would love to share some instructional resources that are science of reading aligned, vetted, and have been shown and proven through schools either I have worked with or colleagues have worked with to be really effective at teaching students how to become proficient readers, particularly at teaching those early phonemic awareness and phonics skills. And some of them are free, which is our favorite word as educators, right? First, we have the West Virginia phonics lessons. These are all linked here too, and you'll be able to click on them, click on the links and go to the sites after the session. These are free resources, free lessons that are on the Tools for Reading website now, which is Mary Dahlgren's site. And they are incredible. They're organized by sound pattern, and each sound pattern gets 2 weeks worth of lessons. Again, like I said, they're super aligned to the science of reading. The instruction's very systematic, it's very explicit, they're scripted, all of the resources are printable, so there's nothing that you really are having to make or create on your own. And again, completely free and really high quality instructional resources. I think these are especially have been useful during small group time, or if you have older struggling readers that need more foundational reading skills and aren't quite ready to do that like deep comprehension work after independently reading a text. Also, 95% Group has put out some really excellent resources. They're continuing to build their library of resources and curriculums, and they kind of span grade levels as well. So they go all the way from, K to 2, core phonics instruction to, 3rd through 8th grade struggling readers. And then UFly just came out of the University of Florida. This, again, the majority of this is free. The only thing you have to pay for is the teacher guide. But several of the schools that I work with personally are using it. And I can say from just my experience with them that and observations and walkthroughs in their schools, it is having a huge impact on student learning. And it's also helping teachers know how to teach these things. The way that the lessons are laid out, though, how explicit they are, it is allowing teachers to really understand what does effective phonemic awareness instruction look like? What does effective, what does an effective rollout of a new sound or a new, phoneme grapheme pattern really look like and sound like? So you're not only building student skill and capacity, it really is also helping you build that teacher capacity as well. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Anita Archer's new phonics curriculum, Phonics for Reading. We know she's the queen of explicit instruction, but she worked and created this resource as well. And this is more for your 3rd grade readers and up who are still struggling in particular with multisyllabic word decoding. So if you have those readers in your classrooms that maybe know their consonant and vowel sounds, can decode, I would say, like CVC words, but are really struggling beyond that, this is a great resource for those students. Again, it's inexpensive. It's a teacher manual and a workbook. I've seen it, happening live, and it's something that both teachers and students seem to really enjoy and also produces results. And again, I just encourage you all to use the resources from the literacy library. Also, please reach out to myself or anyone at the Center for Literacy and Learning for support. We are all just super passionate about supporting schools and districts with improving the outcomes for the students of our state. That is all we have for our session today. I want to really thank you all for being here. I know for some of you it's after hours. I appreciate you for taking this time together. I also appreciate you all for all of the work you're doing in your schools and in your districts. It is truly one of the most challenging careers you can choose, and I appreciate you. Thank you. I see you for your work, and we are here to help you. I'm going to put my email in the chat, so if you have any thoughts or questions that come up after this session, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to hear from you all. And I hope that you all come back to the next session, which I believe is on February 28th. And it will be on small group instruction. It's going to be another really, really great session. Thank you all so much. I'll stick around just in case anything comes in the Q&A, but I hope you all have a wonderful evening.